Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live stream here. I am your host, Chirag Joshi, and I am delighted to have you join us today for what promises to be a really exciting and timely session. And I'm joined by Gerard Skybey, who we will make some introductions later. Uh, so, while you're all here, something really exciting has happened here in our region, and that is the release of the National AI plan, which is something that I know we've all been looking forward to for a while and it's been under discussion. So it's great to see that now coming to fruition. And that's why we decided to have this discussion today is, typically you have a lot of surface level commentary and skimming that happens, but we wanted to make sure that, we cover some key insights and keep this in the spirit of a very free flowing discussion. And that's what I always enjoy. Uh, Now, for those of you who don't know me, I have had the privilege of advising some of our nation's well-known organizations as well as governments on cyber strategy, AI governance, risk management, and technical defensible proportionate measures. I currently run Seven Rule Cyber, which is a consulting firm that is providing advisory in a strategic sense to organizations across the spectrum, but primarily focused on critical infrastructure, government, and enterprises. I'm also co founder of Critical Front, which is, I'm proud to say, a sovereign Australian AI security platform. And I'm just going to share a very few slides with you today. The intent here is to not get into a PowerPoint mode, but rather keep it a discussion. But I think it's important to have some anchoring slides so we all working off the same base. And I'll also hand over Gerard in a bit for introductions as well. So let me just get some slides across and then we can get started. So I'm hoping you all can see some of the slides that I'm going to be showing you on the screen here. So look, I've started with a bit of an introduction of myself. I do wear a few hats, as I mentioned. I run Seven Rules Cyber. I'm a co-founder of Critical Front. I'm also president of ISACA Sydney, national ambassador for Critical Infrastructure ISAC Australia, which is a really important association and body on fostering collective resilience across essential sectors. I won a few awards along the way and have a few certifications, which is so important in our industries to keep upskilling and keep giving value. And along those lines, I also wrote a couple of books in cybersecurity, which, thanks to a lot of you, have become quite popular. And those seven rules of both the books have led to the name of the company, Seven Rules Cyber. And I also had the fortune of speaking on multiple stages across the world on issues that matter around cybersecurity and AI. And recently had the pleasure of being on the Channel 7 to discuss AI safety. So now today we're talking about national AI plans. Let me just get to it, right? So what is the Australian National AI Plan? So Gerard, if you don't mind, if you just go on mute, I'll call you in. Thank you. Uh, so our national AI plan has three core goals. And these three goals, if you essentially look at them, they are around spreading the opportunity, the benefits, and keeping Australians safe. And those three goals then lead to nine specific actions, right? So I've included a link to the plan. If you haven't looked at the plan, I encourage you to go and check it out. It is a really good document and has set the stage for what's coming next. And when I reflect on it, right, I mean, the intent is not to go through each bullet point, but looking at the key themes. When I reflect on it, what stood out to me was that we are now setting a national direction for AI that is squarely putting AI as an enabler for our country in terms of our economic progress, the well being of our people, and safety of our society. So it's positioning AI as not just technology, but a national enabler. And that is a key shift. Now, the way we have essentially looked at the plan, and if you go through the plan, you will see some themes emerge. And I saw some commentary in the media around this, so I thought it was worthwhile highlighting. Uh, I don't think the intent here was, in my view, it wasn't so much about, introducing new AI regulations or not. I don't think that's the right debate to have. I think the right debate to have is, do we have enough guardrails and guidelines within which we can responsibly harness the full potential of AI? And one of the key things that stood out to me was reliance initially on existing regulatory mechanisms, because that is where it made a sensible starting point. Now, there will be a lot of supporting guidance that is emerging, and I'll talk about some of them. The National AI Center, if you haven't heard of them, I highly encourage you to check them out. They're doing some great work and putting in some publications, some I'll refer to as well. But there is that supporting guidance coming. We do have our voluntary, at this point, voluntary AI safety standards. So you do have some mechanisms coming together that support the existing regulations. Another key bit that stood out to me was establishment of a National AI Safety Institute, which then is tasked with giving guidance to existing regulators and then exploring mechanisms where necessary to bridge that gap, right? So more technical guidance to support the current provisions in place. And the privacy commissioner, she's been quite vocal on this, and I like that the guidance issued around how Privacy Act and those changes will actually influence some of the existing provisions anyway related to AI. So I think that's important for us to keep that in mind. And so when I look at all the 9 actions that come about, the first 3 actions relate to the economic opportunity, right? So they stood out to build out data centers, our compute power, our connectivity to the world, and essentially harnessing investments into those areas, both from the government but also the private sector. And that to me is the foundation. But then spreading the benefits actually is really interesting because it raises the profile of sorry, Gerard, there is some background noise. If you could just mute it, please, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
sorry, I'm actually trying to. I don't see the controls, Chirag, so I'm trying my best to. Let me just switch this off.
Oh, good, no worries. So on the key bits around the human aspect of it, I think that's really important, because there is now the expectation that we will need to make this a human issue and focus on how we upskill our people to harness AI. And it's not just training them on the security or privacy aspects that are close to our heart, but it's also how do you basically use this to actually effectively grow your businesses as SMEs, as professionals upskilling in the workforce? What's the impact on you? And that's why I really liked some of the scaling adoption and supporting Australians, as well as improving public service. So, how does government itself, and there is actually a guidance separately available for Australian public service. And I like that because the idea is we leverage AI for the benefit of the government for its own good, then that helps all of us. But the one that I think a lot of us will see a value for today's discussion will be the focus on mitigating harms and promoting responsible practices. So I'm keen to go into those with you because to me, that's the game changer. That's the game changer of making this squarely a board and executive issue as opposed to it being a technical issue, because now the expectation is we need to do this responsibly. While we are not taking the EU style restrictive approach, there are plenty of existing regulatory mechanisms, both through, if you think about APRA, ASIC, the privacy commissioner, our existing regulations which relates to copyright. There is a lot currently there, so a lot of legislative instruments exist. So it's not always, in my view, just because you don't have mandatory guardrails defined means there are no expectations. There are. It's just that we recognize that we need to be more nimble and flexible to grow it as an economy. So those are some of the key bits that I reflected on. And the last thing I'll say before I hand over to Gerard is there is a big focus on data sovereignty, especially of First Nations people and vulnerable sections of society. And I think that's well founded because as we harness the full power of AI into agriculture, into mining, into nature conservation, it has a cultural impact. And we need to be respectful of the cultural dimension of AI. And that's why I really like them being called out. Now, we know data is at the heart of any AI plan. So you cannot have good AI without good data. So data management, data governance will be essentially the lifeblood of how good AI will work. But respecting the cultural boundaries to me and calling that out explicitly is a good step forward. So this is kind of my overview of what I've seen so far. And before I go into very specific things that I also want to call out, I want to take this opportunity. I know, Gerard, you were having some issues, but hopefully those are sorted. If you can please come on and just give a quick introduction about yourself and what were your reflections on National AI Plan, and then we can get into some more details later.
Mm, thanks, Craig. Everyone, nice to meet you. I'll apologise for my connection issues, but I think we've all had those before. I've been working in the data and AI space for quite a long time now. I actually started one of the first practices in the region, or that was probably about 15 years ago, and led that to acquisition by Deloitte, where I recently retired as a senior partner there. And since I've been supporting, doing some independent advisory work, and the privilege of supporting the Critical Front.ai initiative in partnership with Chirag. It is an awesome step forward. The plan really does set the stage for setting up Australia to be quite an influential player. I think not just nationally, but setting ourselves up for success, but also understanding the geopolitical implications of getting this right. So understanding that it's not even just an APAC perspective, but an Indo-Pacific one. So Australia's influence and the amount of I guess thought leadership and capability that we have. I think we're very privileged for a country that has such a relatively small population to actually play such a significant and influential role in this domain. And we happen to be at the very centre of a very, very critical theatre, being the Indo-Pacific, in terms of the role that Australia could play. So an amazing opportunity to set ourselves up for success. But obviously, I think we've taken a very different approach. And so the first thing that really sort of struck me was, the fact that we're not introducing any sort of new legislation here. And that's probably a good thing, because it usually makes things very difficult to enforce and to adhere to, but rather giving everyone the freedom and the opportunity to sort of, use the plan as a set of guidelines. But it also shows that we've got existing frameworks that are robust enough that we can, follow and rely on, say, there are other regulators, for example, that do have enforceable undertakings. So look at APRA as one specific example. Well, they could probably, organisations like them could actually take those additional steps as required to enforce things from perhaps, say, an industry specific perspective. No, it's a great step forward, but obviously there will be challenges implementing it. I think the other thing that sort of struck me was also the amount of investment that was being discussed as well. So, I'm sure we'll maybe cover some of these topics, as we go through the discussion.
And look, Gerard, and I really like those points. And I think one thing which also I wanted to highlight is if you think about, existing regulations, and I'm thinking cybersecurity, right? Because, that's something that is always close to my heart. And I look at the intersection of some of what we're talking about in the plan with Critical Infrastructure Act, so SOCI, Security of Critical Infrastructure. We're talking about data centers. We're talking about undersea cables. We're talking about compute facilities with large amounts of data storage as well. And obviously, there is an environmental side that I'm not just touching right now, but there are existing provisions within the SOCI Act that would extend here, similar to the Privacy Act that extend here. And in fact, and I encourage people to look at the OAIC, Australian Office of Australian Information Commissioner website, and they call out clearly there are provisions around collection of data, around how you use data, around transparency related to AI. So those apply. So it's not as if they don't. So I think it's important to reflect on that while we kind of have that discussion on should the guardrails have been, mandatory or not. I don't think that's the right discussion here. But that investment conversation is an important one, Gerard. And I've seen some criticism come about in the media on the nature of investment and the scale of investment that has been put forward as potentially not being adequate. From my standpoint, look, you could always do more, right? But we need to start somewhere, and we need to think about, we're already punching above our weight in terms of AI adoption in this country, and they kind of called out Claude as an example of, us doing as number 3. And then from a size of our country, how much we're able to do in terms of innovation in this space. I think there's a lot we are about punching above the weight, but I do agree. I mean, there is an aspect of investment that will come in handy, but I think this is a starting position. I don't think this is the end position. So sometimes I do encourage people to have some patience, and that's my view. Now, I know people may disagree, but what are your thoughts, Gerard? Let's just unpack the investment discussion and then we'll move on to some other topics.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, look, just at a very say macro level, I think the government's committing to what appears to be maybe a few $100 billion of spend. Right now, with respect to the ambitions though that are actually in the pipeline, you think is it actually enough money to set us up for success? And arguably, with really enormous ambitions, you could argue that it's actually not enough money. And I look at and I think all of us have actually, the attention we're paying attention to what's happening, especially in the United States and the volume of investment that's pouring in there. It is interesting to see that perhaps, we've got this sort of, perhaps a bit of a perfect opportunity, all these amazing ingredients coming together to set up Australia to be this incredibly influential player, but the government is maybe sort of not stepping up to the plate just yet. I'm not saying that they're not, but perhaps there's also, this requirement of leaning on industry to invest significantly as well. Look, there's been some amazing announcements, obviously from some of the key players, but I think though when you actually start understanding, how does this impact the small and medium businesses, for example, individuals, when we start operating at a more micro level, then it is sort of interesting to understand, well, what are the implications for some of the smaller operators out there, and actually even smaller enterprises who may not necessarily have the same level of investment. So this is where the opportunity now comes, where okay, well, what advantages do I have in order to sort of gain some competitive advantage? And agility is a big one. And I think those that end up joining the dots, Chirag, are the ones that will be able to set themselves up to be really competitive players in this market. It is interesting that some of the tools that are out there are not necessarily, it's not just about, I think we've had enough of processes and frameworks. There's been
Mm.
a lot of discussion, that's out there and documentation that's out there, but really it's the systems that actually need to play a role to help automate and enforce some of these processes that are going to be needed to be successful. And no doubt, like, obviously we look at, some of the typical industries where they invest in material ways, like banks, financial services as an example. No doubt there'll be enormous investment in systems there. But it will be interesting to see how it plays out even in that space where, I look at traditional businesses really having to think outside the square in order to stay competitive and to stay successful. Does that mean that they'll be creating new businesses on top of traditional ones? Let's see. But I think though what is important is that for a lot of the other players in this space and those that may not have access to so much capital, well, leveraging the tools that are out there and getting creative and joining the dots. And I talk about what was released in October as an example from the National AI Centre. So those 6 principles, the AI 6 principles, there are things that
Yeah.
people can do to get ahead of the curve a lot faster than others.
And yeah, and we'll come to those. I think that's really good point. Is there are mechanisms, and that's what I suggest, right? I mean, when I'm talking to boards as part of my consulting work, it's what's the strategic signaling, what can we do now, what can we influence, and I think that's what they want to focus on, because they also want to realize value from investing in AI. And I think that's where thinking about that more strategically is important, but as a nation is giving that enabling capability. And I think that's something which to your point we do need to see a bit more of, and I hope we do. Hope this is just a start, not the end.
Mm, mm,
So maybe let me just come to the next slide that I was going to talk about, right? So there are 3 core things that stuck out to me. Uh, and again, in the world we live, like, it's a bit of a joke, right? That AI writes reports and AI reads reports. So, like, the humans are almost not involved. And, but I think it's important for us to dig deeper into this. And that's why we are doing this session. So, there were 3 things that stood out to me as beyond what I've already said in terms of First Nations and data sovereignty. Uh, the first one was AI oversight has now become a board level competency. It is an expectation now. Because if you look at not just the plan actually says this, but so do the different frameworks and practices it refers to as the de facto practices in that space. And I'll come to the essential 6 that you mentioned with National AI Center. But the accountability is now squarely with the boards, and they are accountable for the impacts, the failures, and the systemic impacts of some of the AI work, because it scales so quickly that the impact can be quite large and systemic if you don't think about it, with a design in mind. So it's not so much the outputs of AI, but governing it as a material risk, no different than how you would treat financial or legal, because it is closely tied to them, similar to how cyber does. It sits across all of them. And and this is the expectation when, if you are regulated by a major regulator like ASIC, APRA, or others, you probably have that anyway. And now this is one more thing, because AI sits across all these different pillars of digital trust: privacy, security, assurance, audit, human safety. So I think that is the first theme that stuck out to me. Is now, I know boards were looking at it, the ones who I'm working with anyway, but it's a national expectation now. It's not restricted to just some entities here or there. The next one I saw was other expectation is around governance, transparency, and testing. So what I liked is it shifted the responsible AI from an optional good practice to expected organizational behavior. And some of the principles around becoming clear when AI has been used is such a big part, because it helps. And I know I've gotten into discussions around transparency as a word, and some people have an opinion of, oh well, it's very difficult to have very transparent AI models, because sometimes even people who design them don't truly understand them. Well, I'm like, even if you put that aside for a second, you can still be transparent about how you have used AI to make decisions for your business and those it impacts. So there is a transparency angle that can be taken, because then it allows for contestability, which is equally important. Is when there is a perceived harm, or there is a perceived undermining of confidence, you have a way of contesting that. But you can't do that until you have that strong governance and transparency pillar that becomes essential to it. So I think that's really important for organizations to start unpacking, is where they are using AI, have they informed the stakeholders, have they essentially engaged them, and have a way of challenging those practices when those are material decisions to be made. And the third one that stuck out to me was around workforce, work health, safety, and cultural impacts are now in scope, right? So it's actually, that's why that whole discussion around it said repeatedly, if you read the document, around First Nations, around women, around other sections of society that could be disproportionately impacted with irresponsible AI, or not, that is governed well. What do you do with those? And so I think that's where that angle now is important, even for organizations to think about, right? Their own practices, their own HR policies, their own work health, safety, and cultural considerations, because it spans people, not just algorithms, right? And there is, and we know, with misinformation, disinformation, and the malicious use of AI, it does turbocharge and perpetuate and unfortunately harm people by certain stereotyping. And I think there are undesirable behaviors like bullying and others. And we'll talk about the big news that we made as a country just yesterday by being the first one to ban under 16. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this to me is a broader extension of that, right? Is cultural impacts now in scope. So those were three that really stuck out to me, Gerard, as the ones that I did not see as much attention as I would have liked to be focused on them from people who've been commenting on it. What are your thoughts?
The one thing that Australia has, which is, rather unique, and look, and it probably may not have been as prominent as what it used to be, but it's certainly incredibly influential, is consultation with the unions. So having that representation, look, it's been a part of our, I guess, our political system, and it's been part of the workplace for almost since inception. The Australian economy has, its workers have had the opportunity to have union representation and to organise themselves to have a single coordinated voice for their respective for the respective groups that they belong to. And it's interesting to see that that plays a big role and makes this plan rather unique, because that's not necessarily represented in, say, what is in place, like using the EU as an obvious example. Definitely understanding the importance of those smaller groups, and your groups of individuals, First Nations, uh, definitely really gives us an opportunity to set the scene for other countries around us as well to be mindful of those things. I mean, it's very easy to leave people behind. When technology is moving much faster, especially in an environment where technology is moving much faster than legislation, I think it's important that this plan stops to consider that, to protect those groups of people respectively, to make sure that that their rights, and also, but I guess also more so that their knowledge and capability and skills are uplifted as part of this, so that no one gets left behind. It'll be difficult to enforce. I think the reality is that technology moves extremely fast. But yeah, I think it's just good to know that that is in there and that it's covered, to such an extent.
Yeah, great points. And I think, yeah, because that's when you call it out in a plan of this nature, it automatically puts focus on it, right? And then that allows us to think, and this is why a theme I wanted to unpack is it could have been easily lost in a discussion around, are we investing enough? Are we, building enough data centers or compute? That's not, I'm not saying that's not an important conversation. That is. But this is also equally vital, is we are thinking of it from a societal impact. Before we had this plan, we had guardrails, right? We have had ISO 42001, and we have other type of NIST type frameworks out there around AI adoption. So there have been material in the media, and critical front, we've looked at guardrails and we've published guardrails. So we've done work. But I like the fact that it goes down to this detail, because when we talk about societal impacts, now there is some frame of reference for an Australian context that can be then further expanded into. So that was useful. So appreciate the thoughts there. All right, the next thing which I want to talk about is this were the essentials. And this is what I think, Gerard, you referred to earlier. And you know how in the cyber world we have this essential eight, which I gotta say I have mixed feelings about. While it, for those of you who are working in cybersecurity, you know what I mean in Australian context when we have our essential eight practices, where to me they were a starting point, a foundational point, not the end game because they weren't big enough and holistic enough, but they were a sensible starting point. But I look at this as essential six for AI, and this is what the National AI Center put forward, right, as some of the essentials. And I encourage people to check them out, because there are two versions of this. One of this is for like the basic version, another one is for the more mature organizations with details, right? But essentially, where these go are consistent with some of the national AI plan, which is why there is that linkage. So it starts with accountability, right? It starts with having that accountable executive who is responsible for business decisions and impacts related to AI. It's not an IT thing. It's not a security thing. It is ultimately a board and executive governance discussion. Then the impact and stakeholder management is understanding the harm which can be done and thinking about the AI use cases, and then the stakeholders and engaging them in it. Now, for those of you who are still sticking with us, I encourage you to please do so, because after this, I'm also going to give you a 90-day plan. And that I think is going to be the most useful thing I hope you can take away from this discussion, apart from all the other great insights. So the third bit is risk management, is effective measurements of AI related risks. And this is a new area. Bias, discrimination, safety. There are some new risk categories emerging that are distinctively special when it comes to AI, because the nature of harm can be so much quicker, bigger, and more impactful to humans. And which is why risk management is a key part there. There's transparency and documentation. I think we've talked about transparency a fair bit, is ensuring that people have a way of contesting any AI made decisions, but also documenting it. And supply chain is a big part of it, is when you're working with vendors and you're bringing in AI models or AI applications, you need to consider supply chain. People who have developed it, people who are supporting it, people who are actually going to be in charge of customizing or continually improving it. You need to have that supply chain mapped out, because that is a key part of your dependency. And if you haven't documented that, at least for your material use cases, it's going to be a challenge. Testing and monitoring, I think this is a risk-based exercise again, so the higher impact use cases. And I think that's where our work with Critical Front and 7 Rules Cyber has been so vital, is because we articulated the use cases, the common use cases and the common risks. because then that allowed us to think about testing and monitoring in a more effective fashion as opposed to being just motherhood statements. And then lastly, human control. Uh, there is absolutely, for higher impact cases, you need to have human oversight, because where you don't have human oversight, and in risk models that I put together, that to me is automatically something that becomes high inherent risk, especially for the use case that impacts humans, be it financial decisions, be it your rights as a citizen or a consumer or a customer, uh, be it areas where your hiring and your job performance comes in, or where massive amounts of data of sensitive populations is collected, right? If you don't have human control in those machines and safety, that's a challenge. So these were the essentials, which I really like, and I encourage you all to check it out. There's a link at the bottom, but the National AI Center, you can look it up and look at the essentials that they've put together. And before I move into the 90-day plan, which I'm very keen on unpacking, because I think I want to make sure our audience here leaves away with something tangible. Gerard, I would like to your reaction, because I know you've been looking at this space very closely, and I know you're working on some great guidance that we'll share later around these essentials.
Yep. I mean, I think at the end of the day, Trag, and I appreciate we're probably pressed for time, and I do strongly like we'll publish an article that'll actually articulate in some detail what those immediate steps that you could take to actually help commence your journey in case you're a little bit behind. But the reality is though is that some of these are not necessarily so straightforward to implement. And I think what we've experienced up until now is a lot of people just resorting to processes of frameworks and documentation that sits there in SharePoint versus real systems that can help automate and bring this to life. So I think what we want to do is share that detail with this audience and for others to consume. And look, and I feel though up until recently it's not really been front and center in terms of the attention, say, for example, from the board level specifically, it really is front and center for them right now. So, it is critical that this is enabled, that it's activated, and it's done, to great effect to basically transform these organizations and for them to be truly AI enabled. If an organization is not able to within say 60 seconds produce a report that says who's doing what with AI and where, then you've got a problem. And this is where systems and tools like such as Critical Front as an example, these are the things that we're trying to solve.
No, well said on that one. Look, I do want to now. I think there are some aspects we can cover though, and this is why I wanted to put this together. And we will release more written guidance and more specific examples as well. But I wanted to put this together really quickly to ensure that our audience has a 90-day blueprint where you can get started. And I encourage you all to also ask questions if you have any of me or Gerard. But I know this session is also recorded, and if you are watching it on LinkedIn or YouTube, you can put in some comments, and we'll look to respond to those. So 90-day blueprint. This is what we were talking about, Gerard. Is the first thing. Your first 30 days has to be about visibility. If you don't know what you have, how are you going to manage it, right? That's an age-old principle, applies to most things in life. But for AI, you do need to develop a live AI inventory of use cases and identify shadow AI in your organization. And this is really vital, right? So what I mean by that is you don't have to worry about getting, it's not overwhelming. Start with what you already know, but put them in a structured way. What's the system? What's the use case? A single system can have multiple use cases, and that's why I don't talk systems. I talk about use cases. You could be using ChatGPT to summarize emails, or using ChatGPT to make decisions related to financial information, or related using ChatGPT to figure out if you like a resume and you want to hire that person. Same system, widely different use cases, widely different impacts on people, widely different risks, right? So you got to think about use cases, not just systems. But shadow AI, what I mean by that is there are a lot of AI applications being used in many organizations that your IT teams or your executives have no visibility over. And what that does is it puts you at risk of not just data exposure, but also potentially perpetuating some bad practices and business decisions that are relying on really faulty information, right? So I think that to me is something that you can start off with. And then once you build those use cases out, critical decisions that are influenced by AI, I think that'll become natural extension of it. And then as we talked about accountability, you absolutely need to account for each use case and system. Who's the accountable executive? Who makes decisions on that system, the risk that it'll introduce, and in the future, what the system can do or what that use case can expand into? You need to have that business accountability. The next step, after you set up that foundation of visibility and control, which is your first 30 days, and I could be optimistic, but then there are people and tools who can help you if you don't have them internally. But I encourage you to start there. But the next phase then becomes is you need to build governance and technical assurance. What do I mean by that? Is when you identify these use cases and you started to now form a way of allocating risk levels to them, which hopefully also align with your enterprise risk taxonomy, uh, you can then start to introduce decision pathways. And what I mean by that is risk appetite. When who's going to make decisions if it exceeds that risk appetite? Is it the board? Is it the executive? Is it the delegate that might report into an executive? Who makes decision at what levels? How do your architecture review boards and architecture practices in your organization inform those designs? What designs even goes to those forums, right? That's practically how you start to think about risk decision pathways and the minimum standards. So there's a lot of talk of AI policy and guardrails, right? You may choose not to develop a standalone AI policy, but you absolutely need to ensure that AI usage, responsible usage, and practices do reflect in your existing policy suite somewhere if you're not going to come up with an AI policy. And you need to have these behavioral standards and guardrails from a human standpoint, also technology standpoint. And that's where we talked about essential practices that National AI Center has put together. But you can also look at ISO 42001, things that we've done and Critical Front and spoken about. Like there are categories of guardrails, there are aspects with NIST and OWASP and other bodies are now building out, which then you need to define for a certain risk level what's the expected behavior and put them in. And then you have human oversight that comes in with the higher risk use cases. I spoke about that earlier. But then stress test high risk systems, right? This is just good hygiene. A lot of AI deployment is good technology deployment hygiene, good change management, good testing, good monitoring. You need to ensure that happens. And then explainability, governance, data provenance, and you need to ensure where is that data coming from that you're using, right? What's the lineage? What systems? Who owned it? Are you allowed to use it? Have you gotten the right permissions? If you're just taking data out of open source, that comes with challenges security wise but also reliability wise. So I think that's important to kind of work through, and this will require a cross-disciplinary approach. This won't be a CIO sitting in a room with technology people. This will be a cross-disciplinary approach of legal, of technology, of risk, of finance sitting together to work these out. And then as you reach to the latter end of your 90-day journey, the last, but very vital step is now you start to train boards and executives in AI oversight and responsibility. Like you're hopefully engaging them throughout this, but this is where you actually start to train them because you have enough now for them to make it real. It's not abstract anymore. There is enough for them to look at and do it. And then with this, because you've done this work now, you can also look and assess if your current work health and safety, fairness, workforce related policies are fit for purpose. And then operationalize contestability. So you obviously declared now by this stage what is AI driven, what are decision pathways. Now allow for people to contest that. We ask for more information, escalate where required, have assurance practices that is just good behavior. And then finally, you now have a governance model. And so you start to align with the regulations that you need to meet by, and then look at some continuous improvement. So hopefully this is a jump start. You may not do all of this in the first 90 days, but these are the priorities that you should be structuring your program around. So when I'm working with organizations, this is what I start with. And I go into each, and some may require more work into one discipline than others, but this gives you a sense of where to go. Gerard, over to you. Are there any thoughts that you have on this blueprint?
Yeah, so I mean, in my recent conversations, with multiple executives across, say the major banks. Um, this is absolutely front of mind for them right now. So they've got a lot of frameworks, they've got a lot of processes in place, but the systems are addressing some of these, not all of them. There are a lot of gaps, and they are absolutely mindful of those gaps and working to close them very, very quickly. I think your points around lineage and visibility are critical here. I mean, the ability to understand not necessarily what models, necessarily just what models people are using for what purpose, and the whole sort of concept of shadow AI, and to the extent that it's being used, but who is doing what with what data in the organization. And so I think this is a really important time where different capabilities really need to come together. And no doubt it is, having a short term, action plan that rallies the troops to set the stage for, strategic implementation of this capability is definitely front and center for a lot of executives right now. So I think it is important that, anyone that is working in this space understands what it takes to actually just get started. And I think these critical points are all here. And there'll be more about this, Chirag, in some of the things that, we're going to be publishing in the coming weeks.
Yes, absolutely. So, and there is so much more even within each of these points, right? Like actually, I was there is, and to your point, there this requires a full-fledged governance document and some guidance documents, which I know we are doing with some of the work that we're going to put together. But this is just a high-level view. But at least this gives people enough to know what areas they want to cover, and there are no blind spots. So it's just a blueprint for them to get started.
Yeah.
So I think we are coming close to the end of our conversation here, and we've had a lot of interesting topics in my view to cover. Uh, Gerard, I think I do want to open it up now if there are any questions from the audience to take them. But I know that as people comment on this later, we will be monitoring both our LinkedIn and YouTube channels to ensure that we respond to you where appropriate. Uh, Gerard, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I do want to ask you, as you kind of think about some closing thoughts,
Yeah, I
what
think it
would you
is.
like to leave people with?
Yeah, look, I think it is important for people, like, regardless of, a lot of these plans, it is a strategy, it is a plan. It may not necessarily come across because it's not legislation as something that has any teeth to it, but it is definitely something that people should get excited about and understand that if they take the initiative to, take this opportunity by the horns and implement, this capability in their organizations, that it really is a unique opportunity, and perhaps once in a generational sort of opportunity to take a leap forward against your respective competitors. And I think it is important to understand, though, that there are other aspects to this that need to come together. So there's a few pieces of the puzzle that this is kind of like this overarching, I think, umbrella, but there's a lot of other sort of relevant and critical information that sits underneath this as well. And look, obviously we'll be, engaging with this audience and community, to help them sort of piece those puzzles together.
Hey, Gerard, one thing I do is always I love having organic discussions, right? And I'd like to throw in some curveballs along the way. And I do think while that wasn't the explicit plan of like this discussion today, because I think we've covered a lot of it. So we'll look at questions and we'll look at comments and we'll do more work there. I think we'll missing out an opportunity if we don't talk about the national, work that is done now in terms of protecting our children with the under 16 social media
Of
ban, as
course.
it's been called. What are your thoughts, man?
Well, well, I mean, it's becoming clear that, I mean, I think, well, maybe I think most parents who parents of teenagers probably already understand how clever and forward thinking, teenagers are with respect to technology. They're already finding workarounds. So, there are ways to sort of work and game the system to still get access to some of these tools. Look, I think, a lot of the responsibility in terms of content that is shared, should be put on those that publish that content. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in that space already, although it's very hard to enforce. I mean, if people want to sort of organizations, corporations sort of want to take advantage of having access to such, massive audiences, then they should also be accountable for what is published and providing, I mean, we look at sort of the principles that we talk about here around accountability, responsibility, risk assessment management, data governance, transparency, all these controls. Well, I would love to sort of see transparency from those organizations about how they enforce those processes, because I certainly hear of stories where there's been great success stories where people complain about certain things and content is blocked or taken off or accounts taken online, offline. But there are also sort of scenarios where you sort of scratch your head and going, how come that's still there, or why is that content still there, as an example. So I think it would be interesting to see how this strategy, this plan, and say some of the principles that we were talking about from other sort of publications, are actually brought to life in those social media sort of outlets, as an example. So yeah, look, I think it's great. The concept is a good one. However, there's a negative aspect to that in terms of teenagers' relationships are very digital these days, and the way that kids socialize or teenagers socialize, it is very different from, say, the experience that perhaps you and I and others on this live stream have actually experienced before. So I think we need to be mindful about that too. So good intentions, how well it's going to be executed, let's see.
Yeah, look, I've been doing a lot of speaking on the safety aspect, right? I was talking about, and I've spoken about the risks it poses to developing minds. Now, there are several aspects that come to me, right? So if you think about social media algorithms and some of these companion chatbots, by the way, uh, they can influence young minds in a very, very different way than you and I perhaps would be influenced by that, right?
Mm.
So some of the, like when I spoke about companion chatbots in one of my discussions, one of the organizations who's kind of leading, they have a leading product there, they decided to get children off it. So that was the first one where it's like they themselves recognize that we don't know how it in fact impacts young minds. So there is clearly a problem that needs to be addressed. And when I looked at, like, the whole of world's eyes is on us right now. So I always say, look, we always want Australia to lead the charge, right? Like, have that ambition of be that driver. And in our national AI plan, we work with, like, we didn't go into that too much, but there is a lot of their stuff where we're working with Singapore, the UK, Korea, India, and others to do work there. So we are a part of the international community and leading the charge there. But with this stuff, I was looking at different presses around the world, and everybody's looking at us to see how this plays out. Because there is that desire to do something, and nobody took that step that we took boldly, ambitiously, to go in that direction. Now, the expectation is actually on technology providers here and platforms, not so much the kids, in terms of, like, who's on the hook for it, right?
Mm.
And yes, and I always said, if your age restriction is your only tool, it's not enough. That will be bypassed. It will happen. But it's what else do you do? But we are almost setting that expectation now that more is expected of these providers, where they need to do more in terms of understanding the type of content that is presented to kids, the way their information is used, the way it impacts them. And this to me is a tone setter. It is that, that idea of, well, if you're under a certain age, you can't drink alcohol or you can't be driving, right? And I think it's that point of, you recognize that there are risks which come with it, and we are living in this very new world right now. So yes, I agree, there is a lot more that needs to be studied, to be understood. And even the technologies that are around age assurance, we got to be careful of some of them, because there are some that work well, some we don't know yet, and we might be collecting more information that we need to secure anyway to ensure that we need to keep proving our identity. So, like, the jury is still out on how this all plays out, but to me, it was a step, to your point, uh, that was required. Somebody had to put that step forward to see, hey, we need to do something about it. And I think we took that as a pretty strong step. Hey, by the way, while we were talking, and I was going to wrap up, but we got some like a question in there, some comments in, but they're not questions. But there was one which is a question, and that's a question around uh, hello, with Australia looking to strengthen rights around automated decision making, I'm curious how prepared do you think organizations are to explain their AI driven decisions that are both transparent and compliant?
Mm,
It's a very good question. Maybe do
it
you want to
is.
start first, Gerard, and I'll
Mm,
chime in after
yeah,
that.
I think there is a reality that they're really not ready yet. So I think, when we think about, I mean, I look at the capability that exists across a lot of our sort of major, uh, a lot of the major enterprises, certainly the ones that I've been connected with. I think the intention is absolutely there to solve that problem. And some of the capabilities absolutely in place right now to answer part of the question, but not all of it. And certainly no ability to answer it, like I had referred to earlier, say within 60 seconds, generate the report that shows me what models have been executed by who and what, by who, and what data has it touched, and how has that been transformed along the way? What decisions did the model make to produce that final outcome? It's not there the way it needs to be. And I think that's probably, that actually, it's not probably, it is absolutely one of the objectives of this national plan. It is absolutely one of the objectives of those six principles that we've been referring to as well, which came out from the National AI Centre, to help businesses understand how to get there in order to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And again, I'd made that comment around sort of, guidance, like strategy, guidance versus sort of, legislation, like something without teeth. I think you're starting to find that, certainly, like, I know that in the financial services space, APRA is absolutely, acutely aware, and they have used their teeth before in different contexts, I might add, and not necessarily or specifically to do with AI, but it absolutely is there, and I've got no doubt it'll be starting to get enforced, with vigor. Yeah, no doubt.
And I think it's also to the question. I feel like there is an intent. I do think that organizations, it depends on how mature the organization is. I think there are some organizations that are further up on their maturity journey in terms of, because they have the resources perhaps, or they started early, or they were in the industries that were highly regulated. I think they have started to do work in that space around because they know what they have. So they've been able to move in that direction of aligning with privacy practices, with actually transparently, mentioning how decisions are being made. But then there is a wide range of industries that were not in those categories that are very much still in the early days.
Mm,
Some of them don't even know what they have. Some of them have just turned on some, native AI capabilities that are still running wild, right, without truly understanding the impact. So I think there is a lot of work that still needs to happen for
mm,
those organizations. But the expectations had to come. And with the AI plan, with the National AI Center doing the work, with some of these other behaviors and the privacy commissioner's work is key here, because that is something that can anchor for a lot of organizations not covered with other regulators that might be more, heavily regulated spaces. This sits across all of them. And when that language is coming from the privacy commissioner, I think that's going to be a very important, pivot point for organizations to take it more seriously. So there is definitely interest, which is why we have these discussions, and so many people are reaching
mm,
out to us to have that. But we are still very early in the process. Is my answer to
mm.
that question.
Yeah, Treg, I might add to that just very, very quickly. So we talk a lot about DevOps processes, and that's something everyone on this call sort of understands. And then certainly in the data and AI space, there was, a flavor of that referred to as data DevOps, and that has its own specific or, slight unique, its unique flavor to the DevOps process. But now, we've seen the evolution of ML ops, and, essentially now what is becoming, I guess, an AI DevOps process. And I think the idea is, how can you have a process that provides that explainability, that observability? And with respect to that, let's not forget what the plan was talking about with, what's the human aspect to this process? How is that human intervention sort of relevant rather than just sort of, ceremonial sort of in nature? and it's interesting to see that our plan talks about having a human element and an aspect to it versus, there are some countries where I get the sense that, they think about all out automation, where there is this trust in machines, versus, having humans sort of involved in potentially, say, semi-autonomous processes. So yeah, interesting, to see that, we're taking this slightly humanist approach, to the whole AI era that's ahead of us.
Are really good. Hey, look, I think I always enjoy these discussions, and I'm very mindful. I could speak about this like for next 3 4 hours, and I don't think everybody else will have the same patience. So I think it's time to wrap this up. Thank you, Gerard, for your time. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts. And again,
Thanks, Chirag.
this is
Yeah.
just the first conversation, right? We'll have so much more that we're going to be discussing and sharing with the community. So keep an eye out for that in terms of what we're going to be sharing via Critical Front as well as Seven Tools Cyber. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us today, and for those who are going to watch this later, please reach out, connect with us on LinkedIn. As all of you know, I'm very active there, and I'm always looking to engage with good discussions. So let's do that. And with this, I will wish you all a great rest of your day, and we'll catch up with you next time. Thank you.